Hi, everybody. Just before we start getting into things, I have a quick survey that I want to give you. If you want to open up your Top Hat accounts, that would be great. So you know that at the end of the semester, you always have evaluations to fill out about the professor, about the course. I kind of want to do an unofficial evaluation partway through the semester, in part because obviously due to COVID, classes have been shifting to online. And I originally developed this class to be taught in person. I've had to sort of shift things to online. So I want to get a little bit of feedback about your experiences with the class so far throughout the semester. So I have a few questions in Top Hat I'd like you to respond to. These are all anonymous questions, so I won't be able to know what your response was. But I would like you to answer these questions just so I can get a little bit of feedback about how the course is going. So if you want to open up your Top Hat, and I'll share my screen as well, then we'll take a look at these questions. Okay, give me 1 second here. There we go. Okay, these are, I think there's 6 questions here. And the first couple just deal with how you're finding different aspects of the class. And so first question is just, how are you finding the difficulty of the exams in the class? I'll give you a few seconds to respond to that. And as I said, these are completely unofficial. None of this is going to anyone at FIU other than me. So I'm just doing it to see if there's certain things that I can improve on for the class. Okay, let's move on to the second question. I just want to know how you're finding the difficulty of the quizzes. Okay, let's move on to the third question. How useful are you finding the PowerPoint lecture notes? Okay, let's go to question 4. How are you finding the speed with which I'm going through the material? Am I going too fast, too slow, or just about right? And obviously I misspelled quick there. Okay. How clear do you find my explanations of various social psychological concepts? And then I have, I think, just one final question. Oh, I guess I have two questions, actually. If you had the option, obviously you didn't because of COVID, it had to be online, but if you had the option, would you have preferred to take this class regular, like in person in a regular classroom, or online like we're doing now? Then I have one final question, which is open-ended. So I allow you to, or should allow you to type in your response. If you have any other constructive feedback, so it could be positive or negative, whatever, about this class or the teaching or whatever, if you have any feedback, you should be able to type into like a text entry box. Again, this is anonymous. I won't be able to know who gave what feedback, but I believe you should be able to type it into a text entry box. I'll give you a couple minutes to do that. I'll give you about one more minute if you're still typing. Got about 30 seconds or so before I close this down. All right, all responses in. Okay, I'm assuming everybody's responded who wants to. Again, thank you again for doing this. I appreciate this. This is good feedback for me, and I'll take a look at these responses after class today. Okay, so let's get back into lecture. Okay, so just to refresh your memory as to what we were talking about, I had just introduced the concept of persuasion. We had talked, we're generally in the subtopic of social influence, which is how our behavior is influenced by the presence of others. And so we talked about this with respect to conformity, for instance. Now we tend to conform our behavior to that of others. And I just introduced the topic of persuasion, which is another type of social influence, where people are trying directly to change your attitudes. And so every time that you see a commercial or an ad, for instance, Those are persuasion attempts, trying to change your opinion, trying to change your attitude towards some product, with the hope that if your attitude changes towards a product, if it becomes more positive towards their product, you're more likely to buy their product, right? So that's a classic example of persuasion, although there's many other contexts, of course, of which persuasion occurs as well. And there was one general idea that I had given to you already in this section, which is that we often behave sort of mindlessly. We've seen that before in other aspects of social psychology. It's why we tend to rely on heuristics and things, because we don't really like to think a whole lot if we can avoid it. And that principle is going to be really important when we talk about persuasion as well. Because if we're not motivated to think in depth about a message, then what that means is that people might be able to manipulate us by changing sort of superficial variables. And so I want to look at some of the factors that lead people to be persuaded. And in doing so, I'm going to talk about persuasion in light of what's called the elaboration likelihood model, or the ELM for short. This is sort of a dominant theoretical structure for how to think about persuasion. So the basic idea here is that people don't always have either the motivation or the ability to think in depth, to evaluate all messages carefully. Sometimes we can. If we're sufficiently motivated, if we have enough cognitive resources available to us, we could, if we wanted to, think about a message in depth. But a lot of the times we simply don't have that motivation, or we simply don't have that ability. And that's what the elaboration likelihood model sort of capitalizes on, this tendency for us to sometimes think in depth about an issue, but a lot of times we're not thinking in depth about an issue. And the type of persuasion that occurs, the nature of the thinking, for instance, that goes along with the persuasive message, whether people are willing to think in depth or not, determines the type of persuasion that occurs. Okay? And this will hopefully become a little bit clearer once I show you what the elaboration likelihood model is. This idea that we are not always motivated to think in depth about a message that we're faced with is captured by this saying here. The receptive ability of the masses is very limited, their understanding small. On the other hand, they have a great power of forgetting. So this person knew the limitations that people have when they're analyzing a message. The problem was that the person who gave this quote was Adolf Hitler. And unfortunately, by understanding how people can be persuaded by potentially unimportant variables, because the receptive ability of the masses is limited, for instance, he could use that, he leveraged that towards his own ends. So I think it's really important for us to understand how we're persuaded and why we're persuaded by the variables we're persuaded by. So the first thing I want to talk about is how the elaboration likelihood model is structured. And so according to the elaboration likelihood model, we can be persuaded along one of two routes. One of those routes is called the peripheral route to persuasion. We would say that people are on the peripheral route to persuasion in conditions where we don't really like to think very much, or we're not motivated to think in depth. When we're on the peripheral route to persuasion, we're not thinking in depth about a message, then people tend to be influenced or persuaded by simple cues that are present in the situation. I'll give you some examples here. So if you take this beer ad, for instance, obviously we've got an attractive woman offering beer, right? Now, the attractiveness of the woman in this ad has nothing to do with the beer itself, right? It's completely irrelevant as to the quality of the beer. And yet we know from research that people tend to be more persuaded by commercials, by ads that have attractive people in them, even though attractiveness is completely irrelevant to the message itself, right? So that's an example of a cue that can influence people to be persuaded that is sort of completely irrelevant. And if we were thinking in depth about this message, we would not be influenced by it, right? But because we don't really like to think in depth, we're often influenced by things like that. And there's lots of examples of other types of these sort of superficial or simple cues. So for instance, ads that tend to have some sort of humor in them tend to be more persuasive to people than ads that are found to be somewhat more boring, let's say. Source credibility. This means that, so if you've ever seen commercials that say something like 4 to 5 dentists recommend this toothpaste, right? Well, that's relying on people's ability or people's tendency to be influenced by just the perceived credibility of the person making the argument. Now, the problem that we're going to see later on is that people can manipulate those sorts of cues. So for instance, if you are a toothpaste company, you can keep selecting groups of dentists and ask them for the recommendations until you find a group of 4 out of 5 that recommend that toothpaste, and then you're technically accurate when you're saying 4 to 5 dentists recommend this, right? So you can actually easily manipulate source credibility. But the important idea here is that the logic behind the argument is independent of the credibility of the person making the argument. Okay? And that might become clear a little later on when I tell you about a study that looked at that specifically. But a couple other cues that influence people who are on the peripheral route are the fluency of the person making the arguments. So you can imagine that, let's say you're listening to a debate between 2 people, and one person is very, very fluent. So they don't have a lot of ums and ahs. They're not stuttering very much. It's very, very fluent, right? And the other person does have a lot more ums and ahs and sort of stops and starts again. It's much less fluent. We tend to be much more persuaded by people who sound fluent to us than people who are not fluent. And again, you should notice that the fluency of the speaker is completely irrelevant to the content of the message that they're giving. So again, if we were thinking in depth, we might think that we wouldn't be influenced by fluency. But because we're on the peripheral route to persuasion, we often are. Or you can imagine a situation where you've got, let's say, 2 people in a debate, and one person makes 5 arguments for their point, and the other person makes only 2 arguments for their point. If we're on the peripheral route to persuasion and we're not really thinking about the content of the message, we might simply be more influenced by the person who makes 5 arguments as opposed to 2, because we're not really evaluating the content of those arguments. Now, just because someone gives you 5 arguments instead of 2 doesn't mean those arguments are better. But if we're on the peripheral route and we're not thinking about the content of the arguments, we'll often be persuaded by that superficial variable. So here's another example of celebrity basically being a variable that affects people on the peripheral route. So a number of years ago, Heinz ketchup came out with bottles of ketchup that had like a little quote by some sort of famous person on them. So this was Lindsay Lohan, who said, "Burgerlicious." Now, I don't really care about Lindsay Lohan's opinions on Heinz ketchup, right? That shouldn't really logically influence my decision to buy Heinz ketchup. And yet, if people are on the peripheral route to persuasion, we tend to be influenced by things like celebrity endorsements. That's why things like this works, even though logically speaking, there doesn't seem to be a reason why Lindsay Lohan's endorsement, she's not an expert in tomatoes or anything. So there's no reason why she should be particularly relevant when thinking about what ketchup to buy, but it does influence people who are on the peripheral route. So in contrast to being on the peripheral route to persuasion, people can also be on the central route to persuasion. And people are on the central route to persuasion under conditions where they are both motivated to think in depth about the message, they want to think about it, and as well that they have the ability to think about it. So if you're distracted thinking about something else, for instance, you don't have enough cognitive resources to spend analyzing a given message or a commercial. But if you're not otherwise distracted and you have those cognitive resources available, you can choose to think carefully about a message. So under these conditions, if we're on the central route to persuasion, now is when people will analyze the content of the message itself and the relevant arguments that are being made. So this is where people will be influenced by things like the quality of the arguments being made or the coherence of the arguments being made. Now, it's really easy to find examples of commercials that rely on people being on the peripheral route when they're not motivated to think in depth. It's a little trickier to find examples of commercials or ads that rely on people being on the central route to persuasion. But here's one. So let's say that you're on the market for a house, right? You want to buy a house. Well, that's a huge purchase. And when we're willing to spend hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars in this case to buy a house, we're highly motivated to make sure we're buying the best house possible, right? If you're just deciding between whether to buy Coke or Pepsi, I mean, who cares? It's $1.50 or $2 or whatever. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't really motivate us to think in depth about a message. But if you're willing to spend $1 million on a house, we're going to be very motivated to think in depth about that message, right? So what that means is that when selling houses, the people who put those ads out basically assume that people who are on the market to buy a house will be on the central route to persuasion. And so you're not going to see a bunch of attractive models trying to sell this house because that relies on people being on the peripheral route to persuasion. Rather, what you're going to get are arguments related to the purchase that are relevant, right? So you've got a picture of the house, you've got a description saying enjoy the holidays in this elegant residence set among high hedges and English gardens on over 2 acres, offered exclusively for 3.25 million. Okay, so that's the type of information people might want to know, right? That's relevant to the argument that's being made as to why they should buy the house. You're not going to find things like that when you're looking at things like, let's say, Doritos commercials. You're probably not going to find a whole lot of logical arguments as to why you should buy Doritos over the next brand. It's going to rely more on things like attractiveness and humor and things of that nature because they assume people are on the peripheral route. Okay, so the key idea behind the elaboration likelihood model is that people are not persuaded similarly by the same variables. Okay, whether a variable influences someone depends on whether that person is on the central route or the peripheral route. That's the key insight of the elaboration likelihood model. And so we're going to think of this model, and we're going to use this model to contextualize all the findings that we're going to talk about from now on, looking at the effects of persuasion. And so over the course of this lecture, I'm going to talk about 3 general classes of variables that affect how people are persuaded. So I'm going to talk about variables related to the audience, the people who are receiving the persuasive message. I'm going to talk about variables related to the source of the message, the person making the arguments. And I'm going to talk about variables related to the message itself. And all these things affect persuasion, as we're going to see. But remember, we're going to think about this in the context of the elaboration likelihood model. So let's start with this first class of variables, variables related to the audience. And the first one we're going to talk about, probably the most important variable that matters, is the involvement of the audience in the message. Alternatively, you could say the relevance of the message to the audience. It's the same thing, okay? So the idea here is that, and this is a variable that shifts people from one route to another route. So what we're saying here is that if you have an audience that's involved in the message, meaning the message is relevant to them directly, those people are going to be more motivated to want to analyze the message, to think in depth about it because it affects them. As a consequence, what that means is that when the audience is involved, they're going to tend to be on the central route to persuasion. If they're not involved, meaning the message isn't really relevant to them, then who cares? Why would I spend my cognitive resources analyzing a message that's completely irrelevant to me? So I'm not really going to spend those cognitive resources. So I'm going to be more on the peripheral route if I'm not involved in the message. Okay, so what I'm going to do is to describe an experimental paradigm that researchers have used to look at these sorts of factors. And this paradigm is really important to understand in order to understand the next few slides, okay? So I'm gonna strongly recommend that if you don't pay attention to anything else this lecture, that you pay attention for the next 10 minutes or 15 minutes or so as I go over this basic paradigm and I go over the pattern of results that are consistent with the elaboration likelihood model. Okay, so here's the basic idea. So researchers can't simply claim that involvement leads people to be on the central route. They have to test this idea, right? So here's the basic experimental paradigm that researchers came up with to test this idea. So imagine the following. So researchers go to a high school and they're going to give a talk to high school students. The talk they're going to give is on why we should institute comprehensive cumulative exams at the end of your high school career. So in other words, at the very end of your high school career, you have to take one final exam that tests you on everything you've learned over the past 4 years. And you have to pass that exam to pass high school, to get out of high school. That's the basic idea. And so the people are coming in to argue why these exams are important to have, okay? So they're gonna argue this in front of high school students. Now, the first thing the researchers do is they wanna manipulate whether people are involved in the issue or not. In other words, whether that issue is relevant to them or not. So for half of the students, they tell them that these exams, they're thinking about instituting them next year. And if they're instituted next year, that's going to affect all of these people. These students might have to take those exams. So that makes it relevant to them, right? In other words, we say they're involved in the issue. The other half of the students are told that these exams won't be instituted for at least 10 years. Hopefully, these students will be out of high school in 10 years, right? So it doesn't really matter to them, in other words, whether they get instituted or not, because they're not going to be there to experience them. So they're not going to be involved. So that's how the researchers manipulated the level of involvement of the audience in this message. The second thing the researchers manipulated was whether they gave really good, strong arguments for why these comprehensive exams should be instituted, or whether they gave really weak arguments. So, in other words, half of the students heard a speaker who gave really strong arguments, who said things like, colleges and universities are increasingly looking to the scores on these comprehensive exams to determine who should get in, right? Okay, well, that's a pretty good argument for having these sorts of exams potentially. So that's a strong argument. On the other hand, another half of participants heard a speaker who gave only really weak arguments. And so a weak argument would be something like, school administration is kind of curious to see how people would do on these exams, which is not really a good justification for those exams, right? So we've got students who are either involved or not involved in the issue, and they hear either really good arguments or really bad arguments for these exams. And then finally, after they hear this speech, everybody is asked to rate how much they agree with having these comprehensive exams. And that's the data I'm going to show you on the next slide. Okay. So when it says post-communication attitude on the y-axis here, that means how much do the students agree that having comprehensive exams is a good idea. So bigger bars means they agree that it's a good idea. Smaller bars means they don't agree. Okay, so it's how much they agree with the speaker. Okay, I'm going to walk you through this. Let's start on the right, and I'll walk you through this pattern of data and what it means, how to interpret it. Okay. Okay, so remember, the high involvement people, these are the students who are told these exams are going to take place next year, so it's relevant to them. And they hear either really good arguments or really bad arguments for having these exams. Now, what these data are indicating is that if these students hear really good arguments for having these exams, well, they come in favor of the exams, right? They tend to agree with the strong arguments, and they agree the exams are a good thing. On the other hand, if they hear only weak arguments for the exams, they recognize that they're weak arguments. They know these aren't really good arguments that they're making, and as a consequence, they don't agree with having these exams. Okay. So what this means is that the fact that this red bar is so much higher than the blue bar means that they're sensitive to the strength of the arguments. They're being influenced if the arguments are strong, they come to agree with the speaker, and they're not influenced at all if the arguments are weak, right? They don't come to agree with the speaker. So the difference in the bars here is showing that these high involvement people are paying attention to the strength of the arguments. In other words, they're on the central route to persuasion. Okay, that's the high involvement people. But now let's look at the low involvement people. These are people who are told these exams won't take place for another 10 years. Well, these people don't really care about this talk, right? Because it's not going to affect them. You can almost think of these people as barely listening to the speaker because they don't really care. And because they're barely listening to the speaker, they're not really sensitive as to whether the speaker is making good arguments or poor arguments. And so what that means is that if you look at the size of the bars, there's a little bit of a difference, but you can imagine that difference is basically negligible, right? That they're barely any more influenced by strong arguments than weak arguments. Whether they hear a strong argument, whether they hear a weak argument, they're roughly equally influenced, right? Because these people are not even paying attention to the strength of the arguments. So what we're seeing is that the high involvement people do pay attention to the arguments because the gap is big. The low involvement people are not paying attention to the strength of the arguments because there is very little gap. They're equally influenced by both, which means the high involvement people are on the central route to persuasion, because by definition, if you're on the central route, you're paying attention to the arguments. And the low involvement people are on the peripheral route to persuasion because they're not paying attention to the strength of the arguments. Okay, that's the basic idea. That's the basic logic behind this study. As we're going to see in a couple minutes, I'm going to give you the same basic paradigm, the same basic experiment, except I'm going to tweak a couple of different things. Okay, if you are lost in understanding the logic of this experiment now, you're going to be lost for the next few slides as well. So for that reason, if you are lost, if you feel like you don't understand something, it's a good time to ask and I can clarify whatever you want clarified. So I'll give you a second if you have any questions here. Okay. But the basic idea here is that for this study, at least, what they showed is that high involvement leads people to go to the center road, to pay attention to the strength of the arguments. Low involvement means you're not going to pay attention to the strength of the arguments. Okay. Yes, so the higher the bar, the more they support the speaker. That's correct. Yep. Okay, now I'm going to put one little twist here. It's a simple twist, but I'll walk you through it, okay? Because there's a couple of different ways that you can display these data. So I display them in terms of bar graphs, which makes sense. You could also display them in terms of line graphs. And so if I were to do that, what I could do is I can take a line and I connect the top of the two red bars, and I can take a line and connect the top of the two blue bars, right? That's all I've done with these lines. And if I took the bars away, I'd end up with this. Okay, now it's the exact same data, right? Just presented in a different format is all. But the reason I like to present it in this format is because it emphasizes where the differences are. So in other words, if you look here for the low involvement people, you find that there's not much of a difference in terms of how much people agreed with the speaker if they heard the speaker make strong arguments or poor arguments. Again, that difference means that those people, the low involvement people, are not paying attention to the strength of the arguments. Okay. On the other hand, the fact that there's a big gap on the right, that means that the high involvement people are paying attention to the strength of the arguments. Because what this is showing is that if they hear strong arguments, they come to agree with the speaker. If they hear weak arguments, they don't agree with the speaker, meaning obviously they're paying attention to the strength of the arguments. Okay. So in all the graphs from here on out, or I guess I'm only showing, I think, two other ones. In those graphs, I'm going to present the data like this line chart. But you could think of it as a bar chart if you want. It's whatever way helps you think about it is fine. I present it as a line graph just because it emphasizes, the line graph emphasizes the difference between the conditions, which is what's important for understanding this. Okay. So this was all getting at this idea that people who are involved in an issue tend to be on the central route to persuasion and therefore pay attention to the strength of the arguments. That's one factor related to the audience that affects persuasion, is level of involvement. Another factor related to the audience that affects persuasion is what's called need for cognition. So throughout the semester, I've basically been saying that we don't like to think very much, right? And although that's true on average, there's going to be some variability. Some people really don't like to think at all. Some people do like to think, right? What we can say is that people differ on that tendency, on their tendency to like to think. They differ in terms of their personality, right? They differ from individual to individual. In other words, that tendency, whether you like to think or not, is an individual difference variable. Okay? An individual difference variable is just any sort of personality factor that varies from person to person. So need for cognition is an individual difference variable in that some people like to think, which would mean they have a high need for cognition, and some people don't like to think, meaning they have a low need for cognition. Whoops. So just to give you an example, and I'll go back to that slide in a second, just to give you an example, there are scales that you can use to measure people's need for cognition. So I could give this scale to, let's say, everybody in this class, and have every individual person fill it out by simply answering true or false to each of these 6 items. And then I can calculate your need for cognition score based on your responses. And I can categorize you as being either high or low in need for cognition based on your responses to the scale. And you can see that the scale measures basically how much you enjoy thinking, right? So some of the items get at that directly. Thinking is not my idea of fun, right? And some of them get at it a little bit more indirectly. So I usually end up deliberating about issues even when they don't affect me personally, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so all these items get at that tendency. Do we like to think or not? Okay, so that's your need for cognition score, right? So it reflects the extent to which you enjoy effortful cognitive activities. So someone who likes to do crosswords and play chess and things like that probably would have a high need for cognition on average. Now, the idea here is that if you think about an audience that you're giving a persuasive message to, if that audience is comprised of people who tend to be high in need for cognition, then these are people who like to think, right? So they're going to tend to like to think about the message that's being given to them. In other words, they're going to tend to be on the central route to persuasion. They're going to tend to analyze the content of the message. And they might do this even if the message isn't really that relevant to them, just because they enjoy thinking about these things in depth. On the other hand, people who are low in need for cognition, who don't like to think, are going to tend to be on the peripheral route to persuasion because they don't want to think about the content of the message. So if you were a speaker and you were trying to determine how do you give the most persuasive message, one of the things you need to know is whether your audience is going to be comprised of people who are high in need for cognition or low in need for cognition, because you're going to design your message very differently depending on which of those answers that you get. If your audience is people high in need for cognition on the central route, you're going to want to talk about the quality of your arguments, right? And if your audience is instead people who are low in need for cognition on the peripheral route, you're probably not going to do that as much. You're probably going to rely more on superficial factors. But again, we can't simply make this claim. We have to test this claim. And so in order to do so, we're going to use that same experimental paradigm I mentioned to you just a minute ago with one little twist. Okay. So again, we're going to be talking about a speaker going into a high school and talking about the need for having these comprehensive exams at the end of their high school career. Okay. Except one little twist here. So in the first variation of this study that I told you about, the students were randomly assigned to be in either a high involvement or a low involvement condition. Remember, that means they were either told these exams were going to take place next year or not for another 10 years. We're going to get rid of that manipulation. So imagine that everybody, all the students are told these exams are going to take place next year. So it's highly relevant for everybody. Okay. So all that happens is then the researchers or the speaker gives one of two speeches. They either make really good arguments for having these exams or really poor arguments, just like in the original version. But they do one other thing that's a little different. What they do is they give all the students a questionnaire and they determine that basically that need for cognition scale that I just showed you. They give them that scale, right? And so all the students fill out true or false for each of those items. And based on their responses, the researchers can figure out which of those students are high in need for cognition and which of the students are low in need for cognition. Okay. Then again, everything is exactly the same as the first study, right? So the speaker gives either good or poor arguments for having these exams, and then the students are asked how much they agree with the speaker. So I have a different label for the y-axis. I probably shouldn't. It should be the same label, right? It's the exact same thing that's being measured. How much the students agree with the speaker. Okay, now I should point out that the graph looks the same as the first graph, but it's not the same thing that's happening. I mean, it's a similar thing that's happening, but it's slightly different. So if we look, for instance, at the people who are high in need for cognition, these are people who like to think. So as a consequence, they're going to tend to be analyzing these persuasive messages. And what we're seeing is that, as we would have predicted, that if they hear strong arguments, they become very much influenced by them, right? They come to agree with the speaker because they're strong arguments. If they hear weak arguments, they recognize they're weak arguments, and therefore they're not influenced by them. So in other words, the fact that there's a gap, a big gap right here, whoops, not there, right there on the right. The fact there's a big gap on the right, that means that those people who are high in need for cognition, are paying attention to the strength of the arguments. Okay. On the other hand, if you look at people who are low in need for cognition, who don't like to think very much, they're not much more influenced by the strong arguments as they are by the weak arguments. In other words, the gap right here is very small, right? Meaning they're not differentiating between strong and weak arguments. And the reason they're not differentiating between them is because they're not even paying attention to the strength of the arguments, because they don't like to think, right? If you don't like to think, you're not going to analyze the messages that these people are giving, so you don't know if the arguments they're making are strong or weak because you're not even paying attention. So what this graph is showing, again, is that people who are high in need for cognition are sensitive to the strength of the arguments, are paying attention to the strength of the arguments. People who are low in need for cognition are not paying attention to the strength of the arguments. Okay. Remember, as a general rule, when you see a slide like this, and because I'm going to throw a little bit of a wrench into this the next time I talk about it, as a general rule, whichever side you see the bigger gap, so there's always going to be on the x-axis 2 groups, whichever group has the bigger gap, so in this case it's on the right here, that means that those people, in this case people who are high in need for cognition, are sensitive to whatever factor is being manipulated. So in this case, it's the strength of arguments. The next time I show this graph, we're going to manipulate a different variable. So it's going to be a little bit different, but that general principle will always hold. Wherever the gap is, that means those people are paying attention to whatever factors in the legend. Okay, so we've seen 2 audience factors then. We've seen 2 audience factors that affect how people are persuaded, right? So level of involvement and need for cognition. A third audience factor that matters, and we're going to talk about this without talking about the elaboration likelihood model, because this is independent of that. But a third factor associated with the audience that affects how people are persuaded is the culture that the audience comes from. So we've seen, and we've talked about cultural differences in this class before between Western cultures like this one and more Eastern cultures like China, Japan, Vietnam, etc. So the types of slogans that people use that tend to be persuasive within a culture are slogans that relate to how people within that culture see themselves. So remember that we saw that in Western cultures, we tend to think of ourselves as individuals that are separate from everybody else, right? And so slogans that emphasize that individualism tend to be successful in Western cultures. So things like "you only better," "a leader among leaders," "make your way through the crowd." All of these slogans emphasize you standing out from everybody else, being different from everybody else. And that's how people in Western cultures like to think of themselves. So these types of ads, these types of slogans are successful in Western cultures. In Eastern cultures, though, that's not how they think of themselves. They don't like to think of themselves as standing out from people. They like to think of themselves as fitting in with people. As a consequence, the types of slogans that people use in Eastern cultures tend to be a little bit different. Things like "our family agrees with the selection of home furnishings." We have a way of bringing people closer together, a more exhilarating way to provide for your family. See, notice that these slogans are emphasizing the interconnectedness that people have with others, right? Bringing people closer together, providing for your family. It's emphasizing the interconnectedness, which tends to be emphasized more in Eastern cultures. Okay, so those are all factors associated with the audience that affects persuasion. Now let's talk about factors associated with the source, the person giving the message. And the first one I want to talk about is the credibility of the person making the argument. So credibility, how credible we find someone, is itself composed of 2 components. Okay, so we tend to find people credible to the extent that that person has some sort of expertise in the subject matter. So I assume that if you've been listening to me throughout the semester and you've been believing what I'm saying, part of the reason that you have been listening to me is because you find me somewhat credible. And part of the reason you find me credible is because you see that I have some sort of expertise in the field. So I've got a doctorate degree in social psychology, for instance. So that gives some expertise, which therefore makes me more credible, say, compared to someone who didn't have that same expertise. So in other words, if someone was teaching you this class in the same way, but didn't have, let's say, a doctorate degree in psychology, you may not pay attention to them as much. You may not listen to them as much because they're not perceived as having the same amount of expertise as, say, I would. But expertise on its own is not sufficient to make someone credible, because a used car salesman, for instance, might have a lot of expertise in terms of they understand cars, but they're not exactly trustworthy, right? They might be lying to you. So in order for someone to be credible, not only do they have to have expertise, but they also have to be perceived as being trustworthy. If you're lacking either of those components, you're not going to have a very credible speaker. Okay? And what research has shown is that people who are more credible, or who are perceived as being more credible because they have expertise and trustworthiness, those speakers tend to be more persuasive. But remember, when we think of these factors that affect persuasiveness, It's going to vary depending on whether people are on the peripheral or the central route to persuasion. And so the question is the credibility of a speaker, is that a factor that influences people who are on the central route to persuasion, or is it a factor that influences people who are on the peripheral route to persuasion? Well, we can solve that with an empirical test, right? With an experiment. And so again, we're going to use that same basic experimental paradigm that I've already discussed, but with a little bit of a twist. So again, we're going back to this experiment where people are going to give a talk to high school students about having these comprehensive exams. Same thing as all the other studies that we've talked about. Okay. Now we're going to go back in that first study when they manipulated whether people were involved in the issue or not. We're going to go back and do that again. So half the students are told these exams are going to take place next year, so they're involved in the issue. Half of the students are told these exams won't take place for another 10 years, so they're not very involved in the issue. Okay, so we're going back to that. But now in both of the prior studies I described, the researchers manipulated the strength of the arguments. We're not going to do that. Okay, so imagine that the speaker always gives the exact same speech to all the students. Okay, they're always given the exact same speech, comprised of pretty good arguments. The only difference now is that for half the audience, they hear a speaker who is introduced as having a doctorate degree in education. That's a high credibility source. The other half of the students are told that the person giving the talk is someone who didn't get past high school, I think it is. That's a low credibility source. Other than that, though, the speakers give the exact same arguments, right? So the only difference is the perceived credibility of the speaker, but not the content of the talk itself. And again, just like in the past studies, at the end of the study, everybody is asked to rate how much they agree with the speaker, how much they agree with the idea of having these comprehensive exams. Okay, so we're back to this graph again. Now you can see the graph looks a little bit different, right? Okay, so again, let's start with let's do the opposite. Let's start with the low involvement people this time, okay? Because that's where the gap is, right? So what this is showing is that the low involvement people, if they hear a talk that comes from someone with a PhD in education, they come to agree with that person, right? That's why the red line is so high. On the other hand, among the people who heard the exact same talk, but they were told it comes from someone who I think just maybe graduated high school, they're not very influenced by that speaker, right? Now, the key here is that the talks are exactly the same, right? It's not the content of the talk that differs. It's only the credibility of the speaker that differs. And so what that means is that the low involvement people who we already know are on the peripheral route to persuasion, they are influenced by the expertise of the speaker. They come to agree with an expert speaker and to not agree with a non-expert speaker, right? Remember my general rule is you find the gap is on the left side this time, right? That means that these people, the low involvement people, are paying attention to this factor, the factor that's in the legend, right? So they're paying attention to the expertise of the source. And so given that we already know low involvement people are on the peripheral route, that means that the expertise of the source, or in other words, the credibility of the source, is a peripheral route factor. It affects people on the peripheral route. On the other hand, if you look at the high involvement people, these are people who we know are on the central route. They're people who want to think about the message because they're told these exams are going to be instituted next year. So they're analyzing the content of the message. They don't really care about the expertise of the source, right? They're equally influenced by an expert as they are by a non-expert. And the reason for that is because the only thing they care about, the only thing they're paying attention to, is the strength of the arguments that are being made. And the arguments are exactly the same for both talks. It's the exact same talk, right? So they recognize, in other words, that the arguments are the same. They're being equally influenced. The expertise of the source doesn't really matter. What matters is the arguments themselves. A strong argument is a strong argument, regardless of whether it comes from someone who has a doctorate degree or someone who only has a high school degree. A strong argument is the same, right? So they're not influenced by that factor, by the expertise of the source. They're only influenced by the strength of the arguments. Okay, so again, we see the low involvement people, because that's where the gap is. That means that the uninvolved people, the low involved people, are responding to the peripheral cue of expertise. Okay, the high involvement people are not. The general rule of thumb here is that the people who are highly involved, or I guess I'll say, make it more general, people on the central route to persuasion, whether that's because they're involved in the issue, because they have a high need for cognition. Center route people care about one thing and one thing only: strength of arguments. That's it. That's the only thing they care about. They're not going to be influenced by anything else. People on the peripheral route to persuasion, and they could be on the peripheral route because they're not involved in the issue, because they don't like to think. Those people on the peripheral route are going to be influenced by anything except the strength of arguments, by the attractiveness of the speaker, by the credibility of the speaker, etc. Okay, again, I want to pause here. If anyone doesn't understand the logic here, now is a great time to ask me to go over it again. So let me know if there's anything you don't understand. I can go over it. Okay, I'm getting no questions so far. Explain the gaps, please. Yep. And the gaps is, whoops, sorry. Nope, back here. The gaps is just sort of a shortcut for figuring this out. So if you want to think about the shortcut to understanding these graphs, then there's only a couple steps you have to do. First off, figure out which side of the graph the bigger gap is on, right? That's on this side for this graph. Wherever that big gap is, that means that those people on the x-axis who have that gap are responding to or are sensitive to whatever the factor is that's in the legend. Okay. Now that's just a generalized way of saying that in this case in particular, low involvement people are influenced by the expertise of the source. They're paying attention to the expertise of the source, and therefore they're influenced by a high expert source and not influenced by a low expertise source. Okay, wherever the gap is not, wherever the smaller gap is, that means that those people are not really paying attention to this factor in the legend. And that means in this case that the high involvement people, because the only thing they care about is strength of arguments, they're not even paying attention to the expertise of the source. It doesn't matter to them, in other words, whether the speaker has a doctorate degree or only a high school degree. All that matters to them is the strength of the arguments. Okay, that's the logic behind these graphs. And so these graphs are useful for showing that there are certain factors that influence one type of person that don't influence another type of person. So the expertise, in this case, influences people on the peripheral route to persuasion, but not people on the central route to persuasion. Meanwhile, the strength of arguments, that influences people on the central route to persuasion, but not people on the peripheral route to persuasion. Okay, we are done with the graphs. Okay, so we won't have to go back to this. You should know them for the exam, but we're done for them as far as lecture is concerned. Okay, one phenomenon which I think is kind of interesting that's related to the credibility of the speaker, although it's independent of the elaboration likelihood model, but it's still an interesting phenomenon, is something called the sleeper effect. The sleeper effect refers to a phenomenon whereby under specific situations, a message can become more impactful over time. Okay, here's what I mean by that. Let's imagine that you're at a grocery store and you're checking out, okay? And as you check out, you see like all those magazines at the checkout, and one of them says something like, doctors have found a cure for cancer. And before you think about that too much, you realize it's from the National Enquirer. Now, the National Enquirer is a really, really low credibility source, right? You don't really believe anything that comes from the National Enquirer. So you immediately say, okay, yeah, right. I don't believe that doctors have found a cure for cancer. Okay. Now, what happens though, over let's say the next 2 weeks, is that we have a tendency to remember messages, but to forget the source from which we heard the message. So over the next 2 weeks, you remember reading about a story where doctors have found a cure for cancer, but you forget that it came from the National Enquirer. And what that means is that at first, although you didn't believe the story because you knew it came from a low credibility source, as you forget the source, that story becomes more and more believable to you, right? Because now you remember, oh yeah, I read doctors have found a cure for cancer, and you don't remember it came from the National Enquirer. And that's what the sleeper effect is. It's the tendency for messages that initially come from a low credibility source to become more impactful, to become more persuasive over time once people forget the source of that message. Okay, so it's just sort of an interesting phenomenon related to the credibility of the source. Okay, but I want to talk about another factor related to the source of the message as well that influences how we're persuaded, and that's the likability of the speaker, of the person giving the message. And like credibility, likability is also composed of two components. In this case, likability is in part a function of similarity. So we've seen that before in this class. We're going to see it again in this class as well, that we like people who are similar to us. That's kind of an important social psychological phenomenon that we see all the time. We've seen in this course that we really like ourselves a lot, right? So if someone's just like me, of course I'm going to like them as well, right? So we like people who are similar to us. This is in part why most politicians, and I say most because Donald Trump was a drastic exception to this, most politicians like to portray themselves as being average Americans. And that's because most voters like people who they perceive as being like themselves. And so that average American that politicians often try to portray themselves as, even though they're oftentimes very, very rich and not at all average, they tend to try to portray themselves like that because voters tend to like that more, and therefore they vote for them more. A second component that affects likability is the physical appeal of the person making the message. Now, this has to do with the attractiveness, like the physical attractiveness of the person giving the message, it has to do with the celebrity of the person giving the message, etc. So messages that have celebrity endorsements or that have attractive spokespeople tend to be more persuasive. So if you think about something like, and even if they're completely unrelated to the product, right? So we've got soccer player David Beckham here on an ad for Sharpies. Now, what does a soccer player have to do with a Sharpie ad, right? It may not make sense if you think about it too much, but if you understand that David Beckham is an attractive celebrity and those things tend to increase the likability of that person, and by increasing the likability, that increases the persuasiveness of the message and therefore maximizes profits. That is why these companies will pay like millions of dollars for a celebrity to endorse their product, even if the celebrity has nothing to do with the product. Now, you can probably guess that this is going to be most likely to affect people who are on the peripheral route to persuasion, right? If you're on the central route to persuasion, you're thinking about the strength of the arguments, you don't care if it's a celebrity endorsement or you don't care if it's a physically attractive person because all you care about is the strength of the arguments. If you're on the peripheral route, on the other hand, we're going to be influenced by things like that, right? So you can imagine people on the peripheral route to persuasion are much more influenced by the likability of the speaker than are people on the central route to persuasion. Okay, so we've talked about a couple factors associated with the source of the message. I now want to talk about a number of factors associated with the message itself that affects how persuasive it is. And I'm going to talk about a couple factors related to whether we're more persuaded by reason and logic or whether we're more persuaded by emotional appeals. So for instance, there are some ways that you might be able to influence people or persuade people by generating a fear appraisal. So for instance, I'll give you a couple examples of this. Let's say these are persuasive messages that are trying to get people to not use cocaine or to quit smoking, right? So the ad says cocaine doesn't make you sexy, it makes you dead. Or the tobacco industry made him history, Sammy Davis Jr., basically saying that he died from tobacco. Now, the idea here is that, or the implicit assumption is that if you scare people, then that will persuade them to not do the activity that has this negative consequence, right? So that the idea here is that if you scare people into thinking that cocaine or tobacco will kill you, then that should decrease the likelihood that people use cocaine or tobacco. And the question is, are these sorts of fear appraisals, trying to scare people, are they effective? Well, the answer to almost all the questions that I'm going to be talking about from now on, to almost all the questions, the answer is it depends, okay? And that's going to be true here as well. It depends. They can be persuasive under specific circumstances. In particular, if these ads, if they rely on a fear appraisal, but they tell people how to avoid the negative outcome, how to avoid the danger, then they tend to be persuasive. We tend to be persuaded by those things. If they don't tell you how to avoid the danger, how to avoid that negative outcome. They tend not to be effective. And the reason they tend not to be effective is because you can imagine that they tend to kind of produce some cognitive dissonance. So let's imagine that I'm a regular cocaine user and I come across this ad saying cocaine's going to kill you, but there's no advice on how to quit cocaine if I'm addicted, say. Like there's no phone number to call if I need help or recovery or anything like that, right? Well, what's going to happen is that, well, if I take cocaine and I think cocaine's going to kill me, well, that's sort of threatening. That's going to create some cognitive dissonance, right? So I start justifying my behavior. Well, cocaine's not really that much of a problem. I might minimize the importance of the conflict, right? And so if I convince myself cocaine's not that much of a problem, I don't change my behavior. On the other hand, if it says cocaine can kill you, here's a number to call if you need help, right? Well, one way to change or one way to reduce cognitive dissonance, if you remember, is to change your behavior. So in other words, if I take cocaine, but I feel like cocaine's going to kill me, if I change my behavior and quit using cocaine, well, then there's no more cognitive dissonance. And so if they give me a phone number to call, or if they tell me how to avoid that danger, that's the easiest route for me to reduce that cognitive dissonance, is to change my behavior. Right? So fear appraisals can work if people are told how to avoid the negative outcome. Otherwise, they don't work as well. I have another question. What about the mood that people are in? Are people more or less persuaded if they're in a happy mood or if they're in a sad mood? Well, what research tends to show is that if you're in a happy mood, if you feel good, it doesn't make you more or less persuadable per se. What it does is it makes you more likely to be on the peripheral route to persuasion. And that's because if you're feeling really good, you're really happy. Well, if we start analyzing things in depth, that it tends to take us out of that happy mindset. So we tend not to want to analyze things. So we tend to be on the peripheral route to persuasion. Okay. And there's a number of pieces of evidence that are consistent with this idea. So for instance, research has shown that people are more persuaded along the peripheral route. They're more influenced by superficial features of the message if they're eating versus if they're not eating, because eating makes us happy. And when we're happy, we tend to be persuaded on the peripheral route. We're not really paying attention to the strength of the arguments. People who are watching comedies are more persuaded on the peripheral route than people who are watching dramas. Again, because comedies make us feel happy. That makes us not want to analyze things in depth, and therefore we're more likely to be persuaded on the peripheral route. Okay, so it's not that feeling happy makes you more or less persuaded. It just shifts which route you're on, shifts you from the central route to the peripheral route. Okay, what about this? Let's say that you're giving a talk to an audience that you know disagrees with you, okay? And you've got one of two options. You can either give your side of the story. You can give a very discrepant talk. So they think X, you think Y, you think the exact opposite, right? So you can give the exact opposite talk to try to pull them as much as possible to your side. They may not come all the way to your side, but you might be able to pull them a little bit closer to your side, right? That's one option. The other option is you can change your talk and you can make it only a little bit discrepant from what they already believe. It's not as discrepant as your actual position, just a little bit discrepant, a little bit different, to try to convince them to move a little bit towards your side. Which of those options is better? In other words, how discrepant, how different should your position be from the position the audience holds if you want to maximize your ability to persuade them? So this guy down here is from the Westboro Baptist Church. So these are a bunch of people who do a lot of really kind of crazy things. So they have gone and protested at the funerals of U.S. soldiers who have died in combat with things like "Thank God for dead soldiers, you're going to hell," that sort of thing. They're very, very extremist. Okay, basically they're giant assholes. Is basically what I'm trying to say. And the question is now their position, which is I'm glad these soldiers died, is very discrepant from the audience, which is that obviously people, especially at funerals of the soldiers, are going to tend to be very pro-soldier. They're going to tend to like these people, to like the soldiers, I mean, to support the soldiers. So it's a very discrepant message. And the question is that sort of discrepancy effective in any way? Well, in general, the answer is no. if you want to maximize your persuasive appeal, then having only a moderate discrepancy with the audience is actually ideal. Because what happens is that if you come out to give a talk that completely disagrees with your audience, they're just going to tune you out. They're not even going to give you the time of day. They're not even going to give you they're not going to like give you 5 minutes for them to think about your message, because it's just too extreme. They'll just reject it too quickly. Just like if you were at a funeral of a soldier, a friend of yours, say, who died, and this person comes along and says, "Thank God for dead soldiers," you're not going to go over to him and have a conversation to figure out why he holds that position. You're going to just ignore him immediately because it's much too discrepant, right? So having moderate discrepancy tends to maximize your ability to persuade someone else. Another factor associated with the message that can affect persuasion is whether that message is what's called one-sided or two-sided. So let's say that you are in a debate, right? So you've got your side and you've got an opponent that's going to give the opposite side. You have one of two strategies that you can use. Your first strategy is to only talk about your side and your points. That's what's called a one-sided argument. Okay, that's one strategy. The second strategy you could use is to use what's called a two-sided strategy or two-sided argument. In that case, you talk about your arguments, and then you also bring up your opponent's arguments and then try to shoot them down. Okay, that's a two-sided argument. And the question is, which one of those arguments, one-sided or two-sided, is most effective at persuading people? And the answer, as I alluded to before, is it depends. So should you acknowledge opposing viewpoints? Well, not always. A one-sided argument in which you only talk about your side, you never even mention the other side. Okay? A one-sided argument is more persuasive if one of two things holds. If the audience already agrees with you, then you only need a one-sided argument. You don't need to bring up the other side because they're already on your side. Or if the audience is simply not aware of the opposing views, then there's no point in bringing them up, right? If they're not even aware of those arguments, then you're actually more persuasive to not bring them up. If you bring them up, then some people in the audience might think that the other side has a point, right? So a one-sided argument is more persuasive if either of these two things holds. Otherwise, two-sided arguments are more persuasive. So if you imagine that you've got an audience of people and the people are aware of the opposing viewpoint, if you don't even bring up the opposing viewpoint, you haven't really tried to rebut it, right? You haven't tried to shoot it down. So it's much more persuasive if you bring up the other side's points and then try to poke holes in their arguments. That's why a two-sided argument is more persuasive if the audience already knows about the opposite perspective. Well, what if you're giving a debate or let's say a speech, and you have the option of going first or going last? Which of those is most persuasive? Well, again, the answer is it depends. It depends on the gap, whether there's a gap between the first and the second argument, basically. So you can imagine a couple different situations. Right, so let's imagine first off that there's going to be a first message. So one speaker provides their message first. Then a second speaker provides their message immediately afterwards. And then sometime down the road, the audience has to make a decision as to which person they agree with the most. Okay. So under these circumstances, it tends to be better to go first. In other words, going first tends to be more persuasive. This is related to something you might have heard about in like a cognitive psychology class called the primacy effect, which is that when you're remembering a list of words, say, words at the very beginning of the list tend to be better remembered than words in the middle of the list. The same sort of principle, more or less, is happening here, whereby what happens is that the first person who gives their message, they set the stage. They create the entire tone. That first message tends to be better remembered than a message that comes immediately after it. Remember that we talked about how when people have beliefs, because of confirmation biases and belief perseverance, it tends to be difficult to change those beliefs. So the first speaker instills the beliefs in the audience, and the second speaker has a much harder time changing them because they've already been instilled. Right? So that's why going first tends to be better, tends to be more persuasive under this situation where you've got this time delay between the second message and the decision. But on the other hand, there might be some conditions under which there's a first message, and instead of the time delay being between the second message and the decision, instead there's a time delay between the first message and the second message, and then some decision comes later. If you've got a delay between your two messages, suddenly things change a little bit. And suddenly in these conditions, the second message tends to be most persuasive. And that's due to something known as the recency effect. And the recency effect also comes out of cognitive psychology, which it's also this phenomenon whereby if you're remembering a list of words, words at the end of the list are remembered better than words in the middle of the list. Okay? And that's because they were presented most recently. So if you've got a big gap between the first message and the second message, and then the audience makes a decision immediately after, what's fresh on their minds is the second message. They might have forgotten the first message entirely. As a consequence, going second tends to be advantageous if the audience is making the decision immediately afterwards because of their fresher memory for that second message. And one last thing I'll talk about is subliminal messages. So in other words, messages that are presented below your level of awareness. So I could be flashing messages on your computer screen right now that are being flashed so quickly that you're not even consciously aware of receiving those messages. It's possible to do that, and those are known as subliminal messages. And the question is, are subliminal messages effective at changing people's behavior, for instance, or at persuading people? Do they work as persuasive messages? The idea that subliminal messages could actually change people's attitudes, could persuade people, came out of a, not exactly a study per se, but it came out of a guy who owned a drive-in theater back in I think it was the 50s or something. And he claimed that what he was doing was he was showing subliminal messages on his drive-in movie screens that said, eat popcorn, drink Coke. And he was flashing them so quickly that no one in the audience ever knew they were exposed to those messages. But that once he flashed those messages, it increased popcorn sales and it increased Coke sales. So the idea was that subliminal messages were influencing people. It turns out, incidentally, that none of that was true. He made up, he never flashed signs that said, eat popcorn, drink Coke on his movie screens. He said that he did to generate publicity for his drive-in theater, but it was all just nonsense that he made up. But the idea that subliminal messages could influence people kind of took hold in the culture that we live in. And so grocery stores would put subliminal messages in their music, background music, that would say things like, if you steal, you'll get caught. But they're presented below people's level of awareness. So they don't know they're hearing them. And the idea was that if you present those subliminal messages, that should reduce shoplifting and things like that. Right? In fact, the band Judas Priest was brought to trial on the basis of a claim that they had supposedly put subliminal messages in their music, which led to teenagers to kill themselves. Now, turns out that those charges were later dropped. And for good reason, because what researchers now know, what psychologists now know, is that with only a few exceptions, if a message is presented subliminally, if it's presented at a level that you're not even aware of, if it's below your level of awareness, it tends not to influence us. Okay? There are some minor exceptions, and we'll talk about one or two of them later on in the course. But for the most part, subliminal messages do not affect our behavior. Okay? And I see Caroline in the chat that aren't they only effective if the person was open to the thing they're being persuaded to do? You're actually kind of right, sort of, and there is kind of an exception related to that. But even that you shouldn't take too far. They can be persuaded only in very, very specific circumstances, such as the person's already open to it, and also there's a bunch of other circumstances as well. As a general rule, though, subliminal messages will not affect your behavior. And we're going to explore that a little bit more next class. Okay, so I'm going to stop things there. So I will see you guys on Thursday. I'll see you then. Thanks. Bye.